The following episode contains difficult subject matter. Please take care while listening.
It really was sort of a hit gone bad. It spiraled out of control, but it showed this new ruthlessness of these gangsters. So it was really like nothing we had ever seen before here in BC.
I bet you didn't know this, but Vancouver is one of the gang capitals of the world. Gang activity exploded in the mid-2000s when there was a flood of guns coming in from the United States. But it wasn't until 2007, when 6 men were murdered in a suburb of Vancouver, that police and the public came to really face this new threat. The killings were known as the Surrey Six, and they were ordered by the leader of a gang called the Red Scorpions. Canada's foremost gang reporter Kim Bolan was the obvious person to follow this case, even if her work put her life in danger. Kim, welcome to Crime Story.
Thanks for having me.
So let's set the scene. It's October 19th, 2007, and 6 people are discovered murdered in an apartment building known as Balmoral Tower. What do we know about what happened?
Well, it was a very strange Friday afternoon because the first reports weren't, in fact, that there had been a gangland murder. The reports came in that there had been a gas leak in this high rise in Surrey, British Columbia. And so I was in the newsroom, a couple of my colleagues were in the newsroom, and we started making calls because we heard there were bodies all over the place. And, we have to remember that one of the people who died, one of the uninvolved people who died was Ed Schellenberg. He owned a gas fitting company. He was going through this building that day and getting the gas fireplaces serviced and ready for use through the winter. So he was actually in his last apartment of the day on the penthouse floor, and that's how he got caught up in this slaughter. So it was natural for people in the building to assume that maybe there was something wrong with the gas system because they knew that the fireplaces were being serviced that day. But investigators knew, obviously, very quickly when they arrived, that some kind of massacre had occurred in this penthouse unit. It was a little longer before we in the media fully understood this catastrophe.
What did they see? Why did they know right away that it wasn't a gas leak?
Well, we know from what subsequently came out at the trial that there were 6 bodies on the ground. They were sort of laid out around the living room. They had coats or blankets over their heads, and each one had been shot execution style. So there were pools of blood around all of them. We saw this horrific footage later in court, and it was honestly one of the worst things that I have ever seen. Some of them were face down. Some of them, fell to the ground, face up. It was just really, really brutal.
And slowly it starts to come out that there is some kind of involvement with the Red Scorpions and also the Bacon brothers. Can you tell me about the gang and the brothers and how they're all associated and what they do?
Well, I would say in the early days, we knew it was a gangland murder. I mean, police had kind of confirmed that, but who was involved hadn't really come out. What had come out and what had become a really big deal locally was that, not only was Ed Schellenberg completely uninvolved in the drug trade, and he was, in his 50s, a family man, so that was like a double tragedy, if you will. But there was also another young man, Chris Mohan, who lived across from the death suite on the penthouse floor with his mom and dad. And he was on his way to a basketball game and was dragged down into the apartment where the gangsters were wreaking havoc, and he ended up dying. So you had 2 uninvolved people, caught up in this, which of course made it resonate more with the general public. And Chris's mom, Eileen Mohan, just became the voice of the victims, if you will, giving media interview after media interview because she really wanted justice for her son.
October 19th, everything stood still for us. And, you took the most precious person out of our lives. He was at home, in his home. You came to our home. You should have stayed where you were. Don't bring your war to our houses.
So we knew it was a gangland murder. We didn't really know who was involved. The Red Scorpions were virtually unknown at this point in time. Even the Bacon brothers, their names had surfaced. Certainly the local police out in Abbotsford, east of Vancouver, knew who they were because they'd been dealing with them since they were teenagers. But the rest of us didn't know.
So tell me about the Bacon brothers. Like, how many were there, and how did they end up becoming the notorious gangsters that they were?
Well, the Bacon brothers were three brothers who grew up in Abbotsford, BC, east of Vancouver. They had a very middle class life. They were involved in school sports. The oldest one, Jonathan, got involved in selling drugs when he was still in high school. He met some more influential drug dealers in the Fraser Valley who kind of took him under their wing. And he was on police radar fairly early on. His younger brothers, Jared and the youngest, Jamie, sort of followed in his footsteps. There's some inkling that the family was well aware of what the boys, if you will, were up to. You know, there were some wiretaps later that were released in court. You know, this sounded like the parents were kind of condoning the behavior. So they became pretty notorious for violence very early on. Their arch rivals were people in the Fraser Valley who were in the United Nations gang. And once the Red Scorpions took in the Bacon brothers in a leadership role, we really had this huge escalation in gang violence between the Bacon-led Red Scorpion gangs and the United Nations gang. And that is honestly a gang war that's still reverberating 20 years later.
So you end up breaking a massive story that links the Surrey 6 murders to the Red Scorpions. What did you learn?
Well, I think we learned, that the Red Scorpions had started in youth detention, if you will. It's another discussion about whether we should be incarcerating young people because they often become more criminalized. They meet people that they can then have relationships with when they get out. We also knew that the Red Scorpions had sort of, there was a group of Persian kids who had founded it with a group of Asian kids, many of whom were refugees. And then suddenly the Bacon brothers got involved, right? Then they became a much more volatile, violent group. We learned that before this Surrey 6 murders took place, the Bacons had been going around taking over drug lines of other groups, and they were taking them over very violently. The way dial-a-doping works here in BC, it's basically like ordering pizza. We don't have gangsters standing on corners for the most part, controlling territory. They control phone lines, right? So if you have the phone, people call that phone. It then gets transferred to a place where the drugs are held and the drugs get delivered, right? So if someone goes and takes over the phone by force, by potentially holding a gun to the head of the person who has the phone, that person then controls the drug line. So this is what the Bacons were doing. It was very ruthless, and they were going to senior gangsters. They were going to members of the Hells Angels, and they were taking over these drug lines. So ironically, at that point in time, you had pretty well every other gang, even gangs that warred with each other, all wanting to go after the Bacon brothers. So it was very, very volatile. And so this young drug dealer, Corey Lau, 22 years old, he had been told by Jamie Bacon's people that he had to pay a tax to them because he was, selling drugs where he shouldn't have been selling drugs, right? He was a pretty cocky young guy, and he refused. He refused to pay this tax to Jamie Bacon. So Bacon put out a hit on one guy, Corey Lau. He was living in a different building, but he was using the penthouse apartment in the Balmoral Tower to stash drugs, to cook drugs. And he was there that day when the killers arrived to take him out. The problem was his brother was also there. Two other drug associates were there. And then Ed Schellenberg and Chris Mohan were dragged into the suite. So it really was sort of a hit gone bad. It spiraled out of control, but it showed the ruthlessness, this new ruthlessness of these gangsters. And they also held those people, for about 20 minutes while they went around finding drugs and money in the apartment. So they knew what was coming because there was this gap of time where they were essentially confined, against their will, wondering what was going to happen. So it was really like nothing we had ever seen before here in BC.
How did the police handle it? I mean, so obviously they were starting to see a rise in gangs, but how difficult was it for them to kind of figure out what had happened and what was going on?
Honestly, I think they had a lot of intelligence about what these guys were up to. It was a matter of turning that intelligence into evidence. In order to do that, they ended up getting a couple of people directly involved in the murders to cooperate. So that was pretty unprecedented at the time, to get people that were involved in the violence themselves to turn on, people in their own gang. The whole thing about brotherhood and loyalty within these organizations, it really is a myth or a mirage, right? These guys are loyal to each other until they're not. So, money was paid to these witnesses. They became known as Person X and Person Y. Person X was directly involved in the murders. He was in the apartment. He shot 3 people in the head and killed them. And he was able to plead guilty to second-degree murder, even though this was clearly a premeditated hit. And he got a life sentence with a minimum term of 15 years. He ended up not testifying for reasons that we will probably never know, because there were some secret hearings that took place that somehow disqualified him as a witness. So Person X got really a great deal because, most people in his circumstance would have gotten a minimum of 25 years. Person Y, on the other hand, pleaded guilty to unrelated murders, got a 25-year to life sentence, and still came to court and testified at the trial. And he really was the linchpin of the Crown's case. He was a very colorful, charismatic witness. He went off the rails a few times when he was on the stand. Remember him once telling the judge, "I'm seeing red. I need to take a break." And she just said, okay, gave him a break. So yeah, he was quite extraordinary. And I found, the more I reported on his testimony, the more the public gallery would fill up with spectators.
Interesting.
People were coming down to check out Person Y and the evidence that he was giving. And police officers who weren't involved in the case were coming in. Lawyers were coming in, because it really was quite an extraordinary thing to see.
Why did he flip? Do you have any idea? Like, can you tell me a bit about him and the person? I know we can't name him. He's still under a publication ban, but why did he flip? What do we know about him?
Well, way back when this happened, I ran a blog through my newspaper, the Vancouver Sun, and it kind of took on a life of its own. And I mention this because, I would write about developments in the Surrey 6 case, and then all these people who didn't have to register to comment would comment on, the goings on, who they believed was behind it. And they were kind of pointing fingers at each other. One fellow would say something like, "That Jamie Bacon, he's a real so-and-so, and he's behind all this, and here's what he's like." And I remember being in his family's basement when he was talking about this. So I would be going, oh my God, like, this is all like potentially defamatory stuff, or stuff that the police might want to get their hands on. And I would just type in, "Hey, can we take the conversation off blog?" And that is how I met Person Y, because Person Y then contacted me directly. And this was after charges were laid, but before we really knew what the Crown's case amounted to. And so I got to know Person Y, and we exchanged very colorful emails for over a year. And he told me he was going to be a witness, and he told me why. He had lost, all loyalty to the Red Scorpions. He felt extremely manipulated by Jamie Bacon, which is ironic because he had a longer gang history and was an older man. But he found Jamie initially to be very charismatic, but quick to turn on people. So as he was heading off to be taken into custody, I just asked him in one last email, "Can I write what you've told me?" And he said, "You can write anything I've said over the last year." So I pieced together this story that I won't reference in detail because I don't want people to be able to figure out who he was. But
because at the time, just to make it clear, at the time, he wasn't in protective custody, and you could say who he was.
I could say who he was with his permission. He sent me photos that he wanted used with the story, right? So it was actually, I've been a reporter for almost 40 years, and it was still one of the most interesting stories I have ever done because he was so interesting. And it was really the inside of the mind of someone who was A, killer himself, and B, still had some sense of decency, of humanity. And he said he had seen Chris Mohan's mom, on the TV news, had read her comments in my stories, and felt so devastated for her that he wanted to try and make it right. And that was why he ultimately decided to testify. He didn't get a lesser sentence. He got a life sentence. So it wasn't like he was doing this to get some benefit for himself, as others, have been accused of doing, right? So, yeah, he was pretty extraordinary. And there was obviously a lot of forensic evidence. There was a lot of really powerful video evidence. But really, it was person-wise testimony that clinched it for the Crown prosecutors.
He also nearly lost his life for this too, right?
Oh, yes. He was targeted without a doubt. And there was a shooting in an underground parking lot. And it was after he had already approached police. So once you approach police, you have to stay generally on the straight and narrow. It doesn't always happen, but that's what you're supposed to do. So he was saying he had just given up his firearm. This is what he told me. And I believe he testified to this as well. And yet there he was, targeted in an underground parkade. He didn't end up getting hit, but the bullets were flying. And he was terrified and very panicked, right? So after that, I believe he was taken kind of into police custody and looked after, while they were working out the deal for him to cooperate.
This was so dangerous for so many people. I mean, we found out later, too, that a number of people who were either going to be called as witnesses or were sort of surrounding this case were killed.
Oh, yeah, without a doubt. I mean, were they killed because they were involved in the drug trade and it was a very volatile period? Or, was it because there was fear they were going to give up information to police? I think it was a bit of both, quite honestly. But, Person X had been targeted in a shooting that was later linked back to the Bacon brothers. And he was one of their best friends, going back a long way with them. So, that sort of cemented it for him that he was going to testify against them, even though, as I said, he didn't end up testifying, but he at least began to cooperate with police. I personally had a run-in with Person X in a Surrey courtroom lobby. I was just checking some information on a computer and he came up and accused me of publishing his address, which I had not done. But, I can't describe him physically, but I'll just say he can be rather intimidating. And he was like, quit publishing addresses. And I'm like, well, I didn't actually publish your address. The police put out a warning that anyone anywhere near you should watch out because you could be targeted. So I reported that. That's all I did, Mr. X. So he got a little punchy. He was kind of hauled off by sheriffs. So the next day, I was not working in the newsroom. I was working home. I get a call from my editor. Oh, Kim, I've got some bad news. I'm like, okay, what's going on? And he said, a package has just arrived in the newsroom. And I thought maybe I was being sued or something like that. That's usually what I think about bad news, right? Oh no, a lawsuit. And he said it was an envelope. It was kind of dripping a little bit with liquids. And this poor woman on the rewrite desk who was having lunch, she opened all the mail and she opened it with chopsticks because it was a bit gooey. So inside was a Ziploc, and inside the Ziploc was a dead rat, right? And there was also a note that said, if I didn't stop publishing addresses, I was going to be killed. And if I didn't stop ratting, I was going to be killed. And it was fascinating. I mean, I had a strong feeling who was behind it. But it was
You're
still,
an investigative journalist, aren't you?
Yeah, after all. Yeah, exactly, right? So anyway, it was still quite unnerving, getting this thing in the mail. And it also upset my colleagues because I, in fact, never did see the rat because by the time I got to the newsroom, the police had taken it, right? Interestingly, no charges were ever laid in connection with that. Apparently, no DNA was found. But I think the real reason no one got charged for threatening to kill a journalist is because it was Person X and he was just about to enter his cooperation agreement with the police. So, imagine someone who's supposed to be some good witness and while he's claiming he wants to do the right thing, he's threatening to kill a journalist, right? And I've had a lot of other threats over the years, and not just from the Red Scorpions, from all sides, right? But that was a very curious thing, for sure.
Yeah. It really is. I mean, it's something. It sort of felt like this was kind of happening even during the trial, right? Not necessarily to you, but even the trial itself and the witnesses and who was coming through became a bit of a fiasco for everybody, right? Including their police conduct.
Well, the police conduct, it was probably halfway through the trial when we thought that the defense was rightfully going to make an issue of the way some police officers behaved on the file. We already knew that there was one officer who had a relationship with a potential witness who
Like
at
a
one point
sexual
had been
relationship.
a sexual relationship, yes. In fact, that young woman's mother reached out to me at one point in time and said, "Oh, we'd like to do a book." This was before it became really as big a deal as it eventually became. But she told me, oh, they had just fallen for each other. But when we learned more details during the trial, it was not a simple love story, if you will. It was police flying back east to talk to potential witnesses and partying with them, having, sexual relationships with them, like really inappropriate behavior. I think three of the officers were involved in the partying, if you will. One was only accused of kind of the cover up, but three out of the four ended up being convicted of breach of trust, charges like that. And they all ended up leaving the RCMP. The people charged in Surrey 6 were convicted. That was Cody Havisher and Matthew Johnston were actually convicted of first-degree murder after a fairly lengthy trial in the fall of 2014. However, that conduct has lingered over the case for the last 10 years, and it's now still before the courts because the Supreme Court of Canada last year ordered a new hearing to see if there was evidence that could be called that would support the defense's claim that the charges should be set aside even after this length of time.
So where does it stand now, though? So yes, those two convictions are being looked at by the Supreme Court, but what about Jamie Bacon and the others?
Yeah, it's been such a long and convoluted route throughout this case because early on, Jamie Bacon's case was severed from the other two accused in the Red Scorpions. Then Jamie's case was sort of hanging out there for year after year. In 2017, after a secret hearing, the charges against Jamie Bacon were stayed.
Wow.
And this was shocking.
Was he in prison during this whole time?
He's been in prison ever since April 3rd of 2009. Still, that was really shocking. So, of course, the Crown appealed that. Then the Court of Appeal overturned the BC Supreme Court judge. So his trial was back on again, right? So, this just kind of went back and forth. And you can imagine how challenging it is for the families, particularly Eileen Mohan, who really never missed a court appearance. Like she was in court throughout every one of these proceedings.
I wrote to the Prime Minister and I wrote to the Minister of Justice, and I've asked them to look into this case and how do we change laws so that families like us, innocent families like us, whose lives are so shattered, we don't have to stand at the doorstep of the courts begging for justice.
So then, shockingly, we were still waiting for Jamie Bacon's trial to take place, and COVID was on. The courthouses were like ghost towns. Most people were calling in, and it was July of 2020, and I was down there for some reason, and I just saw on the court list Jamie Bacon appearing, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I popped into the courtroom, and there was a sheriff there in person. But other than that, the judge and lawyers on both sides were calling in. So they didn't know I was sitting there in the public gallery. And they announced that Jamie Bacon was pleading guilty to conspiracy.
Concerning the murders of the Surrey Six.
Concerning the Surrey Six murders. I mean, this is 2020. The other people had already been convicted for almost 6 years at that point. In his case, first the charge was stayed, then the charge was brought back. So it was still going to be a deal for him because he was getting the first-degree murder charge dropped, but he was going to take responsibility for being behind the planning of the Surrey Six murders. So it was pretty shocking. And, I ended up sort of writing that story. It was very explosive. A few months later, he was sentenced to 18 years minus all the time he had served, and he is still in jail as we speak. He's eligible for statutory release right now, but the parole board recently decided that he was still too much of a risk to let out into the community, so they're keeping him in till the very end of his warrant. Which is, a third more time than most people serve because they get out at statutory release. So that was another pretty shocking thing in this case. There have been so many twists and turns over the last, 16 years now. It's pretty amazing.
There was also an interesting phone call that you heard, right? That had been recorded from him about talking about his life and his reflection on being in the gangs.
Well, it was in 2022. He made a recording, and he sent that recording to, via prison channels. They're not supposed to have cell phones, but honestly, they all have cell phones. I once got a call from Jared Bacon when he was in custody back east, right? In the middle of the night, claiming I was talking crap about him. I'm like, I'm not talking about you at all, Jared. I don't know what you're talking about. And then he goes, I've got to go. And because I assume there was a guard walking down the hallway. So, we know they all have phones. So Jamie made this recording, and the purpose of the recording was to try and get Matthew Johnston, the second guy convicted with Cody Havishar, to turn and cooperate with police and implicate other people in the Red Scorpions and other gangs so that they could maybe get out of prison sooner. And it was a very shocking recording because Jamie Bacon was kind of lamenting gang life. There's really no loyalty. My brother's best friends are turning against me. It was pretty shocking to the general public because this is the guy who was always telling everyone to be loyal and he would have their backs. And then suddenly he was saying everything that, law enforcement always says about gangs. There's no real loyalty. Everyone will turn on you. And, we don't know if he ever did cooperate. I mean, it's not the kind of thing that gets released publicly, but given the recent parole decision saying that he's going to be held in custody even longer, suggests that he's not really cooperating in any big cases at this point in time.
So where are we today? Are any of the Bacon brothers still a significant force?
I would say they are not at all a significant force. They're actually completely isolated. Most of the Red Scorpions who've continued in the drug trade are now realigned with other criminal organizations. The Wolf Pack is a big force. The United Nations gang is bigger than ever. It's growing exponentially. It has international tentacles. In fact, some of the key players have moved to Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. I tracked them there while I was doing some international research a few months ago. And they're trying to avoid, if you can believe it, the gang violence here in BC. So they've set up shop both in Ho Chi Minh City and in Dubai. So our gang landscape is more complicated than it's ever been. The gangs are more powerful, and the people at the top who haven't been killed or gone to prison are making tons of money and have expanded to some of the highest levels internationally in the drug trade.
So do you think that if another murders like the Surrey Six happened today, it would be as shocking as it was back then?
Yes, I think it would be as shocking. I mean, people understand that gang violence can happen anywhere here. It has happened anywhere. It's been in, fancy restaurants. It's been in nightclubs. It's, been in parking lots of malls, hotels, close to schools. So, we've got this gang violence problem, but we haven't seen another case of that magnitude where 6 people lost their lives in one incident.
Okay. Well, Kim, thank you. Thank you for your work, obviously. I mean, we're all sitting back here in awe of what you're able to do. And I appreciate you coming on the program and talking to us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's such an important story to highlight.
You've been listening to Crime Story from CBC Podcasts. We drop a new episode every Monday. You can get our next episode a week early on CBC Podcast's YouTube channel or by subscribing to the CBC Podcast True Crime channel on Apple Podcasts. In addition to early access, subscribers to our True Crime channel also listen ad-free. Crime Story is written and hosted by me. Our producers are Alexis Green and Sarah Clayton. Sound design by Graham McDonald. Our senior producer is Jeff Turner. Our video producer is Evan Agard. Our YouTube producer is John Lee. Executive producers are Cecil Fernandez and Chris Oak. Tanya Springer is CBC Podcast Senior Manager, and Arif Noorani is the Director of CBC Podcasts.